I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio. So today we're talking about how to make sewing feel fun and playful. We're going to cover how to plan your projects so you have fun when you need to have fun, how to improvise more when you're sewing, and how to approach each project so you don't lose your flow. All right, let's get to our icebreaker today. This one came from Deborah D. And Deborah says, I'd like to hear about people's best sewing saves, mistakes that they made when garment sewing that they had to somehow miraculously turn around to make a garment work. As I am a perfectionist of the highest order, I don't tend to have any that don't involve recutting pattern pieces or repurchasing the same fabric to remake or making the garment in another fabric. I prefer crafts where raw materials are reusable. I've been known to unravel entire sweaters numerous times if I don't like the final result. That's a great one, Deborah. What about you, Haley? Do you have a good sewing save?
I mean, I've definitely ruined and saved many projects. Most recently, I made maybe like back when this pattern first came out, the Ruth dress that we have. It's a cute little wrap dress. I made it. I liked it. I probably should have made a muslin because the bodice never fit me quite right. I wore it a couple times and it just hung out in my closet, but I loved the fabric. And last spring, I hacked the bodice off and sewed a little waistband on it and made a wrap skirt, and then took the bodice scraps and I made a ridiculously huge scrunchie, and then cut up the larger bits of the bodice to save for like pocket linings. But then I ended up wearing that skirt all summer long, like heavy rotation in my wardrobe. And that was a really good sewing save. I think I'm always kind of most successful when I try not to be too married to the idea that I had when I set out. Like, I wanted to make a dress with that fabric. It didn't work out. I probably would have just frustrated myself way more if I had stayed true to the dress idea, but instead turning it into a skirt. It was like one of those things that took all of a couple hours to do, but had like the biggest impact. So you can hold on to the perfectionism, but maybe be a little bit more forgiving with the concept.
Yeah.
My advice for Deborah, if she's looking for it.
Yeah, it's amazing because sometimes when those things happen, it's like maybe, an hour of extra work or something like that to actually have something in the end that you get to use. I don't know. Sometimes it seems like it's going to be a big project to change this into something completely different than what you'd imagine. And it's really not that much work considering how much work you put into it to begin with, Totally. Yeah, the one that came to mind for me is I've had a couple of projects over the years where I've accidentally cut into the fabric at various stages of sewing. And I remember one, it was a skirt I was making. This was a while back. The skirt I was making, and it was completely done. I was just cutting off some of the loose threads in the end, and I ended up cutting right into the front of the skirt, the actual fabric. And it was so frustrating. So what I ended up doing was I didn't want to just have like this mended hole in the front of my skirt. So what I ended up doing was I did mend it, and then I decided to put some patch pockets on the front to cover up the area where the hole was. And that worked out perfectly. It had these two really cute patch pockets in the front. They were really functional, because everybody knows pockets are awesome. And you would never know that there was a hole in the skirt or mending in the skirt. So it worked out perfectly. And I wore that skirt all the time. Sometimes you just need like a little bit of a few creative tricks in your back pocket to keep in mind when disaster inevitably strikes.
Or some tricks in your patch pocket,
Yeah, in your patch pocket. In your front patch pocket. Thanks for that icebreaker, Deborah. If you have an icebreaker for a future episode, you can share it with us. If you're a Seamwork member, you can go to seamwork.com/go/icebreakers, and there's a thread there, and you can post yours, and we'll probably use it on a future episode. I also wanted to share, we had a follow-up to an icebreaker from a past episode from Gwen, and I had to share it because I thought it was so funny. In a previous episode, I talked about singing to my cats, the Simon and Garfunkel, The Sound of Silence, but singing it, in meows, so in their native tongue. So Gwen posted a follow-up to this. She said, Sari mentioned meow singing Simon and Garfield. She meant Simon and Garfunkel, but she said Simon and Garfield. Simon and Garfield to her cats. We have 2 highly anxious cats we are trying to introduce. We play music to calm and distract them when they're in the same room together. The day I listened to this episode, my partner put on Simon and Garfunkel's greatest hits. I told him about the podcast, and we proceeded to meow sing through the whole album. The cats were so stunned, they forgot to chase each other. So now we meow sing every time we do free roam together. Works like a charm. I'm so glad I could help, Gwen. I might have a second career as a cat behaviorist. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Seamwork Radio for inspiring your sewing and your cat parenting. Who knew?
So just a hot tip, everyone. If your cats are having some kind of anxiety, try meow singing to them. An entire album of Simon and Garfunkel. I love that it was the entire album too. That really adds something to it.
Committed. And if anyone else has success with this, please let us know.
Please let us know if your cats were also stunned, because this is like two for two. My cats are stunned. Gwen's cats are stunned. I want to know. Does this work on all cats, or is it only some cats?
I hope so.
All right. That was the perfect start to this episode. So we're going to talk about how to make your sewing feel fun and playful today, because I think sometimes sewing is such an involved hobby, and there's so much to think about and so much to learn, and there's so much challenge involved that sometimes people can end up taking it a little too seriously, and that kind of can suck some of the joy out of it at times for some of us, especially if, like Deborah mentioned, if you have perfectionist tendencies. I have those tendencies as well. I find this in many aspects of life, that it's very, very easy for me to suck the joy out of things that I really like by trying to get them right, or trying to do as much as possible, or learn as much as possible, or hit some kind of goal that I've set for myself. This is something that comes up a lot for me. So I really identify with this issue. And I think it's so important to step back and just remember why you do this, and that it is supposed to be something that brings you joy and is just something fun to do with your time and your creativity. So I'm really looking forward to talking about this. So I thought I'd start with, we got a comment a while back from Seamwork member Kathy, and she said, recently when talking to a friend, I likened the difference between the DIY sewing I used to do and my new pursuit of making clothes by following a pattern as the difference between cooking and baking. Like cooking, upcycle/hack/DIY sewing can be very improvisational and allow for a lot of choices and creativity, whereas baking and sewing from patterns is all about very precise measurements and following instructions exactly. And then Kathy goes on to say, I feel like I'm losing some of my sewing mojo because of it. Any tips on how to still feel the joy of improvisation and creativity while learning the basic and necessary skills of dressmaking? I thought this was a great question, and I like that metaphor she used between cooking and baking, as somebody who likes to do both. And I do think baking can be a little bit improvisational too, at least my baking is. So I think this is a really really interesting topic. So I thought I'd start by asking you, Haley, when do you feel the most creative and the most joyful around sewing?
I think it's definitely when I'm deviating from the recipe a little bit, to use Kathy's metaphor a bit, when I'm hacking something, or, veering off of the instructions and doing things a little bit different construction wise. It feels really creative and like a fun puzzle, but I think that's because I'm also in a different place in my sewing journey, and I have a lot of those foundational skills in place, so I can kind of go like off-roading with it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I get that too. I think for me, when I feel the most creative and joyful around sewing is the part where I'm actually planning and thinking about what I'm going to make and what skills I'm going to incorporate, what new techniques. Right now, I'm really into learning about more heirloom sewing and how I can incorporate those types of techniques into my everyday sewing. And that's really, really fun. And I've been buying all these old books from the 80s and 90s on heirloom sewing and looking through them while I drink coffee and just thinking about how I could use some of these techniques with maybe some of the patterns I already have. And that part to me just feels like really fun and really joyful. So I get a big kick out of that, and then just planning out, what fabrics I'm going to use, or what fabrics from my stash I could use, putting things together. That's really, really fun for me,
Mhm.
and I think that's like a big part of the joy of sewing in my life. Is that design part of it.
I'm curious about the flip side of that. When do you feel not so joyful about sewing?
I think when I feel not so joyful about sewing is it bums me out when I have like half finished projects or projects that have just been sitting around for a really long time and I can't get motivated to finish them for one reason or another, either because I'm stuck on something or I'm just not as excited about it as I used to be. I also find, just more generally in life, there are times when life gets really hectic and busy, and sometimes sewing provides a really cool break or respite from everything else that's going on in my life. But again, kind of getting back to the headspace thing of it, it really depends on how I'm approaching it. Because sometimes sewing or any other hobby or any other creative endeavor can also just feel like another item on my to do list and another thing that I'm supposed to be doing, that, I'm supposed to be enjoying this. I'm supposed to make time for this. I started this project. Why haven't I finished it yet? I start putting pressure on myself. And a lot of that comes down to my own brain and like how I'm framing things rather than the actual anything about the external circumstances or sewing itself. It's just more like I'm stressed out. And so I'm putting that stress into everything that I'm doing. What about you?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. For me, my least joyful sewing moments are definitely when are more related to my mindset than anything else. I would say that when I get stuck in a mindset of sewing, like being hyper focused on the end product rather than the process, I feel like I'm going through the motions of sewing and not really fully enjoying myself. And that really diminishes the joy for me.
Yeah, I feel that way too. It's amazing how much of it just comes down to your mindset, you know, in all things really, but
Which is why we talk about it in every single
always,
episode,
yeah.
it seems like. Do you improvise in your sewing at all?
I would say I do a little bit. I guess it depends on how we define improvise. I feel like I often have ideas for improvising on my projects before I start actually like cutting or sewing. So I'm always hacking things like constantly. I don't even remember the last pattern I just sewed without changing something pretty major about it. Either turning it into a maxi or, adding some huge detail that makes it look totally different. That's also, I think, a big source of the fun and joy of sewing for me. So I think that's where my improvisation comes in. Not so much when I'm actually like sitting down at the machine and sewing. By then, I think I have a pretty good idea of what I want to do. Well, it happens from time to time, but I feel like that's where my improvisation comes in. What about you?
I definitely relate. I'm a big like pattern hacker. I love changing things up. I feel like pretty much incapable of making a pattern like, out of the envelope or off the printer, I guess now. I sew more PDF patterns, but I'll leave a little bit of room for improvising. I definitely sew things the way I want to and not the way the instructions advise me to a lot of the time, which can be a good or a bad thing. I'll do little things, kind of like planned improv on my sewing. A good example is I recently sewed a sweater and I was kind of undecided about whether I liked the cuffs or not, or if I just wanted to hem the sleeves. And so I lengthened the sleeves before I cut it out, kind of assuming that I was going to just hem them. And then I cut out the cuffs too. And then I knew that when I tried the garment on before I hemmed and finished everything, if I didn't like it without the cuffs, I could just hack those few inches off and then sew the cuffs on. So I'll leave like maybe some like flexibility, I would say, for myself mid project so that I can make those last minute changes, which can be kind of nice and make you feel like you have like, not all of your choices are laid out in front of you. You have a little bit of wiggle room.
That's interesting. That's like planning for improvisation, just kind of interesting.
Yeah, totally. That's actually kind of a good tip that I don't think is in our list of tips that Sari is about to kick us off with.
Yeah. So that's another one is just kind of, I like that. The idea of leaving yourself some wiggle room to play. If there are certain details you may or may not want to add, you could make sure that you use your fabric or use the order of operations or something, set it up so that you can visualize things and make decisions a little bit later in your project. It's a really cool idea. So I think our first tip is really, again, going back to mindset, which is if you do feel like you're in a place where you're taking your sewing a little bit too seriously, or if it feels really heavy to you, if it's not feeling like something fun and light, I think addressing that first is probably the most important thing of all. Because like I said, I think a lot of it just comes down to how we're treating ourselves and how we're approaching the stress in the rest of our lives. And this is just something that it's something I've been experiencing lately because I've been really, really busy, and I've found that I just feel like every minute is scheduled. I have to multitask constantly to get everything done. And that's carrying over into my personal life, into my hobbies. This last weekend, for example, I'd had a really, really busy week all week. And then I was even dreading the weekend because I was like, I have this huge list of things that I need to do around the house and in my garden and all these things. And I had another commitment on Sunday that I had to go to, and I was getting really, really stressed out about it. And then I spent Saturday working in my garden, and I was outside and it was sunny and it was beautiful. And I just let myself enjoy the moment. And I realized, like all this stress is just coming from in my head. Like this is something I enjoy doing, but I was looking at it like, oh, it's something I have to get done. I have to check it off my list. I have to do this project in the garden while the sun's out and before it starts raining. And, it became so much bigger and more heavy than it really needed to be. So I think that's the first thing is when you notice yourself going into that mindset where the things that you previously enjoyed no longer feel joyful because you just have too much to do, recognize that, I think is the first step. And then if it's something where you're just kind of feeling some fear around it, maybe you're afraid of messing up, you're noticing those perfectionist tendencies coming up, I think that's when you can start questioning and thinking about, what's the worst that can happen? And same if it feels just like another item on your to-do list and you're too busy. It's sort of like, well, if this doesn't get done, if I don't get to my sewing today, if I don't finish this project, is it really the end of the world? Or is this something that I'm doing because it brings me joy and I love to do it? So, I think that's an important question to ask yourself. And then I think another thing that's really helpful is just thinking about, why does it feel more freeing at sometimes than it does at other times? And again, that goes back to maybe some other things that are going on outside of your creative hobbies. Maybe you can start looking into that, because I notice that sewing definitely feels really fun and freeing sometimes, and then other times I just can't get into it, and it's usually not about whatever particular sewing project I'm working on. So those are sort of the mindset things you can explore, just kind of maybe starting at noticing your attitude towards the things that you enjoy, like sewing, and then maybe branching out from there and thinking, okay, when I notice this happening, maybe I need to take a step back and think about why I feel this way about things that are supposed to bring me joy. So that's my big mindset learning for myself lately, and I hope it's helpful to some of you guys too. And then the next thing that I would like to share that has helped me is just planning a project that's really just for fun. And if you get into this kind of mindset and you get into this space where it just feels like really not fun, it just feels like another like big project that's weighing on you, maybe plan something that's just you just really enjoy sewing. Like maybe it's a fabric that you really love working with, or a really fun print that makes you happy, or maybe even making something that's really simple, but something that you'd see every day, like a pillow. I know that like I've been making some things for my house lately instead of making clothing, and I just love it because it's so quick and easy. And then I get to enjoy this beautiful fabric every single day instead of just, once in a while when I wear it. So that's fun. Or maybe just making something that's really impractical. Maybe something that's not, going to be a big wardrobe staple for you, but you're just going to really get a kick out of it and enjoy making it. I think we kind of sometimes get so focused on sewing things that are very practical, and with good reason. That's a big reason why a lot of us sew. But every once in a while, maybe just throw in something that's more fanciful, and that you'll just maybe something you've always wanted to make. I know on my Design Your Wardrobe plan for this summer, one of the things that I really want to make is like a really pretty sort of Victorian inspired nightgown, which is like not something that I need by any means, but it's something that I've always wanted, as like a really pretty sort of heirloomy, like white gauzy sort of nightgown for, having breakfast outside in the summer. And it's just like, it's very whimsical and fanciful, but it would bring me a lot of joy, I think. So incorporating some of those things can be really, really fun and bring some of that spark back. And then I think related to that is just the idea of mixing in some smaller, easier projects once in a while, because it just makes sewing feel like it's not such a big deal if you have some really simple, easy things that you can make. And it's not just all about these large scale projects or completing your wardrobe, but just making something that's really quick and easy and that you'll get a lot of wear out of. Like I have a scrunchie I made, like a silk scrunchie that I made a while back we have a YouTube video on making scrunchies if you want to try this, because I think there's such a great scrap busting project. We'll link to it in the show notes. But I have this scrunchie and I wear it like almost every day, not in my like day to day, but when I have to like put my hair up before bed or when I go to work out or anything, I use a scrunchie constantly. And it took probably like, half an hour to make. So I think some of those projects we can easily overlook, but they can really bring a lot of joy to the actual sewing, and you actually get to use them. So I think those are some tips for planning out some projects that will make you feel happy about sewing again if you're feeling in a rut.
Totally. I think it's so appropriate that your tips are the, mindset tips and the project planning tips, because that's like the sari bread and the sari butter.
That's my wheelhouse. Yeah.
Well, I have a few tips to add to that. I think a big thing is kind of starting to identify too where you feel confident improvising and where you don't feel so confident improvising. And the more of a foundation of sewing skills you have, the easier you'll probably find it to improvise more frequently in your sewing. We talk about the 80-20 rule from time to time on this podcast. And if you're not familiar with that, that's the concept that 80% of your outputs come from 20% of your inputs. So really that core 20% of your sewing skills are going to get you 80% of the way in most sewing projects. So if you're feeling like a little bit more uncomfortable improvising, then focusing on that 20% so that you can get there will really help you. And you can do this in really kind of low pressure ways. I think Sari's idea of mixing in some home deck kind of projects or accessories can be really great because you get to practice things like top stitching or putting in a zipper or adding elastic or gathers to something. And it might seem, I don't know, they might seem really simple at first glance, but all of those things are skills that you need to sew garments. So kind of like tricking yourself into learning some new skills that way can be a really great way to build that foundation for yourself. Another thing that I always recommend, and when I taught in-person sewing classes, I would always tell people to go home and sew the same project again. So if you make a gathered skirt in my class, go home and make the same skirt again, but that next time you sew it, try to have a little bit more fun with it. Use a fabric that you've never used before, or maybe like a really impractical fabric. Like, I don't know, use tulle, use something a little bit more exciting to you. Add like a funky patch pocket, do your thing. I think that the practice of repeating those familiar skills plus like the little secret ingredient of fun is really powerful when it comes to feeling a little bit more of that sewing joy. And it helps you to get to that flow state, I think, because entering the flow state in sewing, in order to do that, you have to have that good balance of challenge and familiar skills, which kind of leads me to my next little batch of tips, which is learn to practice strategies that'll help you avoid losing your sense of flow when you're sewing. So if you start a new project and it has a new detail or a technique that you've never used before, you can do your research beforehand so that you're not like mid-project panicking about how to sew a lapped zipper. You can do your research before, read a couple tutorials, find the method that makes the most sense to your brain. You can even cut some sample pieces and practice it beforehand. And I think going into a project kind of armed with that information and that practice removes a lot of that stress from the situation. And then you don't have that, like, I don't know, I do this all the time with buttonholes. I know how to sew buttonholes, but they're so annoying. They can be such a pain. If I like, right now, I literally have like a cardigan sitting like 2 feet from me that I sewed all of. It needs buttonholes and buttons, but I'm like, oh God, I don't want to sew buttonholes, so I never pick it up.
So many people feel that way about
avoid
buttonholes.
those speed bumps. You know, it's my machine. It has an okay buttonhole function, but it's not like the best. I think it's also because it's a little different on every fabric, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, my little detour about buttonholes. Another tip for making sure that you stay in that flow state is to read the instructions from start to finish before you start. When my grandma taught me how to bake, this is what she told me to do. And I still do it with every recipe that I make, is I always read it from start to finish. So I'm never like caught off guard by something. Everything feels kind of familiar as you're working through each step. And then that gives you the opportunity to, again, go and research those things that don't feel as familiar to you, so you don't have to do it mid-project. Another great resource for this can be watching sew-alongs before you actually sew the garment. We have a whole library of sew-alongs if you're a Seamwork member that you can follow along with. And I'm a big fan of watching them before I sew, not kind of like side by side with sewing, because again, it gives you kind of the benefit of like a repeat sewing project without the extra fabric and work.
That's a great tip.
And then my last tip is kind of related to, well, it is related to sewing. Again, get your mise en place all set up before you start sewing. So get everything out and ready for you. Make sure that you have all of your thread, your notions, that your space is cleared and prepped for cutting and sewing so that you're not like having to stop every 15 minutes and kind of like find something or reorganize your space so you have enough room to do what you need to do. I think that sewing overall just always feels more relaxing and more joyful to me when I feel like the act of sewing is the only thing that I have to focus on.
Yeah, those are awesome tips. So to recap all of our tips for you today, we had quite a few. We started with talking about mindset and really kind of expanding from feeling maybe some stress around sewing and looking at maybe some impacts from the rest of your life and how that's kind of changing your mindset around sewing or any other creative hobby. And then I talked about planning projects so that you'd have more fun. I talked about planning something that you just want to sew for no other reason than you just want to sew it, and mixing in some smaller, easier projects as well. So that's on the project planning side. And then Haley talked about more on the actual sewing side. So on the skills side of it, making sure that you have those 80-20 skills in place so that you feel comfortable improvising. And then she also talked about repeating projects, but then adding in new ideas and new techniques with maybe a project that is tried and true for you. She also talked about reading your instructions from start to finish or watching a sew along from start to finish before you actually make the pattern yourself. And lastly, in order to not break your flow, we talked about mise en place and making sure that everything's in place for you so that you're just ready to go when it's time to sew, and you can just enjoy that flow state and enjoy sewing instead of having to break your concentration and go looking for things. So those are our tips for making sewing feel more fun and more joyful. I hope they're helpful to you. We have some other resources if you're interested. We just did a series recently on sewing by design, which is our framework for approaching sewing. And it can be helpful to just, if you want to listen to that, it can be helpful to see where you're at with your particular goals to help you kind of define what would be fun for you, what would be something that's exciting for you, depending on where you're at in your sewing journey right now. We also have a series of videos on YouTube that you might find really interesting if you're looking for some of those really fun, quick and easy projects. It's called 8 Weeks of Mindful Making, and it covers a whole bunch of really cool, short, easy projects that you can do. And you can find that on our YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/seamworkvideo. We've got a bunch of other great videos up there. So if you're not subscribed to that channel, be sure to check us out there. And the last thing I wanted to mention is another tool that can help you kind of define your goals and what's important to you right now is our sewing quiz. So it's a free quiz on our website, and it helps you to learn what type of sewist you are based on your unique goals and personality. So it's really based on what your goals are in this moment. It can change over time, and it can be really helpful just to kind of figure out what's important to you right now and help you to create projects or a sewing practice that feels good for you as a unique individual. So there are lots of suggestions at the end of what you can make or classes and sew-alongs that you can follow along with depending on where you fall. So it only takes a couple minutes. You can find it at seamwork.com/quiz. Take it there, and hopefully that'll help you out as well. If you like this episode, be sure to leave us a review. We love hearing from you all. So if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can leave us a review there. Spotify now has reviews. You can leave a review on whatever podcast platform that you're currently listening on. We would love, love, love to hear from you. So please do that if you have a second. And you can also follow us on YouTube, as I mentioned, at Seamwork Video is our channel. And you can follow us on Instagram at Seamwork. And if you'd like to join Seamwork and become a part of our private community, plus get access to hundreds of sewing patterns and dozens of sew-along classes, our podcast listeners get 50% off lifetime discount when you join at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. So that's seamwork.com/go/podcast50. And that's 50% off of our unlimited plan. And you get to keep that 50% off price for as long as you're a member, which is really, really awesome. So with that, we're going to sign off for today. I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. Podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.